talk to my constituents, I find with all of the other specifics that they are concerned about, the one thing that just about everybody is concerned about is our long-term fiscal situation. They're worried about debt. They're worried about the deficit in this year that is adding to the debt. And they say to me, what can we do about it? They listen to the pundits who talk on the air about this particular project or that particular project that sound outrageous. Many times the projects are, in fact, legitimate, but they make good copy. And I say, if you add up all of these projects together, the good ones and the bad ones, and eliminated them all, you would reduce the federal deficit by 0.08%. Pardon me, 0.08%, 0.8%. Let's talk about where the money lies. Let's talk about where the challenge is. And so I present to my constituents a series of charts that I will present here that outline where the challenge is. And one of the things that becomes clear as we go into this debate is that it's not just our financial situation that's in trouble. The pressures created by our debt are crossing over into the area of national security. We cannot maintain our military or our diplomatic initiatives with the kinds of pressures continually increasing. So a little bit of history, Mr. President, which I share with my constituents and that I share here as a background for the bill that I will be introducing today. This is a very simple pie chart that shows the components of federal spending back in 1966. I ask my constituents, why do I pick 1966 as the year to start? And some of them know the answer, some of them don't. But in 1966, mandatory spending constituted 26% of the budget, and interest on the national debt, another 7%. You have to pay the interest on the bonds, so that's mandatory spending as well. So the government is committed for a third of the budget before the Congress ever gets around to appropriating any money. Now, in 1966, the biggest portion of mandatory spending was Social Security. And the combination of Social Security and other mandatory programs and the interest cost, 2/3 of the budget, the other one-third of the budget, the other 2/3 was available to the Congress, and of that spending, defense spending was 44% of the total. Defense spending obviously dominated non-defense discretionary spending. Where are we today? What has happened in the years since 1966 and today? Here's the components of federal spending in fiscal 2008. I picked that year before the tsunami hit us, the financial tsunami that caused the meltdown, and all, as perhaps a demonstration of what's happening structurally within the budget, not affected by any particular emergency. Mandatory spending has now grown to 54%, interest costs from 7 to 8%, so that the two of them constitute roughly 2/3 of the budget. From 1966 to 2008, mandatory spending now is twice as big in its proportion of the budget than it used to be. Defense spending has shrunk to a half of what it was back in the 60s, and non-defense discretionary spending is about the same. All right, now back to the question. Why did I pick 1966 as the year to start with? Because that's the year that the federal government got into the medical business and enacted Medicare. And since then, we've added Medicaid, so that today, when you talk about mandatory spending, Social Security is no longer the dominant factor. It's a combination of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, I will leave aside the issue of the value of those programs. I'm just talking about the money that we're spending here. And today, as we argue over congressional spending, we only have 1/3 of the budget to talk about. And half of that, roughly, is defense spending. Let's look out just 10 years. Let's go to fiscal 2009 or fiscal 2010, either way, mandatory spending will then have grown to 59%, the interest rate at 5%, defense will have shrunk, non-defense will have shrunk. Pardon me, 2009, this is the difference between the earlier one. The reason the interest costs are shrinking is because we are borrowing money at a lower rate by virtue of the things that have happened with the financial tsunami. But let's now go out 10 years and see where we will be. In 10 years, mandatory spending will have grown to 58%, the interest costs will have grown to 13%, and defense and non-defense together will constitute only 30%. And if defense is shrunk to 15% of the budget, it begins to bite very seriously into America's role in national security around the world. One author that I have looked at who has talked about America's role in the world in a very thoughtful way looks ahead to this, and he says the greatest threat to America's position in the world is not China, it's not India, it's not North Korea, it's Medicare. The greatest threat to America's ability to sustain itself and its national security is coming from the growth of mandatory spending. And if we spend all of our time arguing over those tiny things that make good copy in newspapers and on television and not addressing this inexorable growth, we will discover that the Congress has become irrelevant. 3/4 of the budget of Congress will already be spent before the Congress even meets. And only 1/4 will be left for us to talk about, and that 1/4 will have to include our spending for national security, and you will see how everything else will get squeezed out. I had that hit me directly as we had the debate last year on the budget resolution for fiscal 2010. Standing at this very place, I looked down at the bill that was presented and sitting here on a podium, and it projected federal revenues for fiscal 2010 at $2.2 trillion, down because of the challenges we had with the economic meltdown. And then on the next page it said mandatory spending, $2.2 trillion. That meant that everything we do in government in fiscal 2010, other than mandatory spending, the Defense Department, the war in Afghanistan, the FAA that controls the airplanes, the national parks, our embassies overseas, the FBI, all of our law enforcement, the border security, everything, every single dime that we spend in government, other than mandatory spending in fiscal 2010, had to be borrowed. We didn't have a single dime of tax revenue available to pay for anything in government because it was all taken up in mandatory spending. All right, what does this do to us long term as a nation if we cannot get this under control? People keep talking about the national debt and how it is growing and growing and growing. Actually, the national debt has not been growing and growing and growing over the years. Here's a chart that shows the national debt measured in the way it should be measured as a percentage of the gross domestic product, the size of the national debt with respect to the size of the economy. To illustrate why this is the way to do it, I've often used this example here on the floor. I ran a company before I came here. When I became the CEO of that company, it was very small. It had a debt of $75,000. When I stepped down to retire prior to running for the Senate, the debt was $7.5 million. And you would say, well, Bob Bennett, you're not a very good manager if you've run the debt up from $75,000 to $7.5 million. And then you look at the debt the way you should look at it. At the time I became the CEO of that company, they were doing under $300,000 a year in total revenues. They had no margin at all. Every dime they took in revenue was eaten up with cost, and they could not make the payments on the $75,000 debt. The $75,000 debt threatened the survival of the company. And when we had a $7.5 million debt, the company was doing over $80 million in business, and we had a 15% margin on sales. We were earning more per year than the whole debt we had, and the only reason we didn't pay it off is because we had some prepayment penalties built into the mortgages that we had established. So I wasn't such a bad steward after all, if you make the measure and totally on the basis of the size of the debt. I was a good steward if you make it on the measure of the debt in relationship to the size of the enterprise. That's what this chart shows. The national debt as a percentage of the size of the enterprise, to use business terms, in this case, the size of the economy. You see that just after the Second World War, our national debt was well over 100% of GDP. And in the decade after the second, 2 decades after the Second World War, we come from 1945 to 1965, the debt has shrunk from over 100% of GDP to close to 30% of GDP. Even though it was going up in nominal dollars, it was coming down as a percentage because the economy was growing so rapidly. And then, once again, we add to our entitlement spending. We add Medicare, and you see that this is the trough, and it begins to grow, and it begins to grow. And when we get to the end of the Cold War, it turns down again because of 2 things. Number one, our defense spending goes down, and the economy booms. We get tremendous growth as a result of the end of the Cold War, and it was at 49.6% when Medicare and Medicaid got started. Medicaid followed. Medicare was ahead of it by a decade or so. And not much different in 1989 at the end of the Cold War, 53. This shows the historic level that it has been. Okay, now, this is the history, and the blue line shows the projections that the Obama administration has given us as to what will happen under their spending plan. One thing we know about projections is that they are always wrong. We don't know whether they're wrong on the high side or the low side, but we know they're always wrong. And what usually happens is that the projections are always optimistic, and that circumstances come in a result that is less than we had hoped for. So if we take this as an optimistic projection, we are saying that when you get out to 2020, which is only a decade away, only 10 years away, the national debt will be back up very close to what it was at the end of the Second World War. And that's unacceptable. Everyone in this chamber knows that entitlement spending is the driving force behind all of this. Everyone in this chamber knows that shaving back a little on this program or cutting out a particular grant on another program will have no real impact on this if we don't have the courage to deal with entitlement spending. And so, Mr. President, today I'm introducing a bill to deal with entitlement spending. I have no illusions that it's going to pass in this Congress, but I want to lay it down so that we at least have a marker from which to begin. I've already done that with Social Security. Several years ago, when I was chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, I held a series of hearings on Social Security and discovered that we can indeed solve the Social Security problem, move numbers around a little, and say to everyone who is currently drawing Social Security, you will continue to draw Social Security throughout your lifetime, adjusted for inflation. Nothing will happen to it. Furthermore, your children can draw the same level of Social Security benefits that you draw, adjusted for inflation, through their lifetimes, without any danger to it. And their children can draw Social Security throughout their lifetimes at exactly the same level, adjusted for inflation, without a tax increase. Well, now, how is that possible, Senator? The way it's possible is to say we're only going to allow Social Security benefits to grow as rapidly as inflation grows. We already have built into the program, we're going to pay Social Security plus inflation plus a nice little kicker along the way. And that nice little kicker along the way over 10 years and then 20 years and then 30 years pretty soon gets you into the kind of trouble that I have described. And if you say, no, we'll allow it to grow with respect to inflation, but we will not allow it to grow any more rapidly than that, and then the kind of thing that happened here can happen here. As the economy grows more rapidly than the inflation rate, we will see the national debt begin to come down. We will see the pressure on national security begin to ease. And we will see the great concern that Americans have about the financial situation that we have begin to be addressed in the way it was addressed in the years after the Second World War. I'm not saying we abolish the entitlement programs. There are some of my constituents who say, that's the thing to do, just abolish Medicare, abolish Social Security. And I say, yeah, you want to abolish these things, but keep the taxes? Because that's what we would have to do if we're going to get the financial circumstance that you like. No, over time we can do this without abolishing these programs, but we have to see to it that they do not grow. So, here's what my bill will do. It will control the growth of entitlement spending by reinstating spending limits and saying that entitlement programs cannot grow at a rate faster than the inflation rate. And that will mean to the future Congresses, if they adopt this bill, okay, we can still spend for Medicare, we can still spend for Medicaid, we can still do the Social Security, but we can't add things to it in such a way that will cause it to grow more rapidly than inflation. Number one. Number two, do the same thing with all non-defense discretionary spending. We will allow you to grow each year in accordance with the inflation rate, but we will not allow you to increase non-defense discretionary spending more rapidly than the inflation rate. And then number three, enforce the spending caps with automatic spending reductions and budget points of order, the details of the kind of thing we get into around here all of the time. Very simple, very straightforward, but it gives the kind of direction that many of the solutions that have been proposed around here don't do. Many of the solutions we have around here sound great, and they're very complicated, and this point of order lies here, and that situation there. But overall, we're turning our back on 2/3 of the federal spending and saying, well, that we won't address because these programs are popular. And we don't want to offend the voters by saying that something has to be done with the most popular programs in America. I find the voters are saying, we have to deal with this. We have to have the courage to deal with it, which means we have to have the courage to deal with entitlement spending and not just focus on non-defense discretionary spending. The final thing my bill would do would be to prohibit the creation of any new mandatory spending programs. And that's, again, part of the problem that we have had. I close, Mr. President, by repeating a question that I ask my constituents as I'm making this presentation to them. I say, how many of you know who Willie Sutton was? And most of my audience is young enough not to know the answer to that question. But there are a few who say, Willie Sutton was a bank robber. And that's true. And he wasn't a very good bank robber because he kept getting caught. And each time he would serve his sentence, and then he would go out after he'd been released from prison and he'd rob another bank. And finally, somebody said to him, and this is why we remember Willie Sutton, not for being a bad bank robber, but for the comment he made. Somebody said, Willie, why do you keep robbing banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. We look at the national debt, we look at the problems we face, and we ask the question, where's the money? We have to rein in the entitlement spending because that's where the money is. 2/3 of the budget now, 3/4 of the budget within 10 years. If we continue to ignore the growth of entitlement spending and focus entirely on the rest of it that makes good press but not good policy, we will find ourselves where our financial situation is up here. Our national debt will be as high as it was, with a percentage of GDP, as it was in the Second World War. And our national security will be threatened to the point that our entire posture around the world will be changed simply because we won't be able to afford it. It's for that reason, Mr. President, that I send to the desk an act that may be cited as the Economic Disaster Prevention Act of 2010 that deals with spending limits on entitlement programs as well as spending limits on discretionary spending and the prohibition of any new mandatory spending programs. I yield the floor.
The bill will be received and appropriately referred. Senator from Oklahoma.
I understand the